On one side were France, Britain, and Russia, which between them had a combined population of about 250 million people. From that, they were able to mobilize about 10 million soldiers. On the other side were Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They had a combined population of only about 150 million people and were able to field only about 6 million troops. All in all, Germany and its allies were outnumbered almost 2-1, both in population and troop numbers. And yet, they still managed to hold on for over 4 years. Not only did they hold on, at times they actually came pretty close to winning, and they actually managed to force Russia to collapse. In my view, almost all of the credit for that astonishing achievement needs to go to the Germans. Both of Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, performed pretty badly in the war, which meant that the Germans were forced to carry the show, and carry the show the Germans did. Even as a Brit, one has to admit that some things that they pulled off were incredibly impressive. A good example is right at the beginning of the war as Russia invaded from the east. The border with Russia was not far from Berlin, so the Russians planned to invade and try to take the German capital. The Germans had to hold off the invasion, but they had a problem. The bulk of their forces had been sent to France in the west, so they only had a relatively small number of men to hold off the Russian invasion. About 250,000 Germans were going to have to try to repel a Russian force that was twice its size. The Germans first met half of the Russian force at the Battle of Tannenberg. Rather than just repelling the Russians, they were able to absolutely annihilate them. The Germans were able to kill, wound, or capture almost 10 Russians for every single man that they lost. The destruction of the Russian force was so total and humiliating that the Russian general actually killed himself rather than live with the shame. However, the German force had no time to rest. They then had to confront the rest of the Russians that were coming from the east. That battle was just as decisive. Once, again, the Russians lost about 10 men for everyone that the Germans lost. I would say that was probably the Germans' most impressive achievement in the war, but there were others. Another is the spring offensive into France in 1918. At that point, the fighting in France had been a stalemate for about 3 1/2 years. Neither side had been able to find a way to overcome the deadlock of trench warfare. However, the Americans had just entered the war, and so the longer the war went on, the less likely it was that the Germans would win. The Germans had to try to win the war quickly, and actually came remarkably close to doing so. They launched a huge offensive, and using new tactics, they advanced a long way and actually made it almost halfway to Paris. The advance did then lose momentum as the Germans ran out of men and were unable to sustain their supply lines. Even so, one has to give credit for the success that they did have. At that point, Germany was desperate with shortages of almost everything. Despite that, it was them that were the first to truly break the stalemate of trench warfare. Both sides had been trying for years, but it was the Germans that managed it first. So, what accounts for that incredibly impressive performance by the German military? How did they manage to seemingly take on all of Europe and still come very close to winning? In this video, I'm going to answer those questions. But first, let's have an overview of what happened. The story of Germany in World War I. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace, and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. There were, of course, tensions between the various countries. Particularly strong were those between Austria and Serbia, who had conflicting claims over land in the Balkans. Serbia had a strong nationalist movement that wanted to see a bigger, grander Serbia that included all the ethnic Serbs in the region. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was by that point very weak, and frankly barely holding itself together. Many people thought it might break apart at any minute, and should that happen, Serbia wanted to be in a position to take as much territory as possible. Serbia was particularly hacked off about something that Austria had done 6 years earlier. Austria had been administering the territory of Bosnia, which was on paper part of the incredibly weak Ottoman Empire. Then in 1908, the world was stunned when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, incorporating it into their empire. Serbia was incensed by that, and some Serbian nationalists actually called for war. Tensions persisted, but Europe just about held itself together. Then came the assassination. On the 28th of June 1914 in Bosnia, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was, of course, outraged by the assassination of
their heir, but they weren't sure how to respond. Should they go to war with Serbia? If not, what should they do?
Their heir, but they weren't sure how to respond. Should they go to war with Serbia? If not, what should they do? Germany was allied with Austria and promised to back it, whatever it chose to do. Meanwhile, Russia was allied with Serbia and promised to defend Serbia should Austria declare war. Eventually, Austria decided that it would send Serbia an ultimatum. Serbia must either accept various humiliating demands or Austria would invade. On the 23rd of July, almost 4 weeks after the assassination, the ultimatum was sent. The Serbians agreed to some, but not all of the ultimatum, and so 5 days later, Austria declared war. The next day, it began shelling the Serbian capital. At the same time, Russia, fearing attack from both Austria and Germany, had been readying its military. That process, known as mobilization, was hugely provocative to Germany. Fearing Russian attack, Germany issued an ultimatum demanding that Russia stop mobilizing. Russia refused, and so Germany declared war. Russia and Germany were at war, and that raised another extremely important question. What was France going to do? You see, France was allied with Russia, and so it was legally obliged to declare war on Germany. However, there was actually the possibility that France would stay neutral and wouldn't get involved. Whether France would get involved was something that the Germans desperately needed to know as soon as possible. The greatest fear of the Germans was that they would end up fighting a two-front war against France and Russia at the same time. If they ended up surrounded like that, there was a very good chance that they would lose. Of course, the preference of the Germans was that France would stay neutral, allowing them to focus on Russia. They sent France an ultimatum demanding that they don't come to Russia's aid. France rejected the ultimatum, and so 3 days later, Germany declared war. Now, at that point, Germany was at war with both France and Russia, but it still had a plan to avoid fighting on two fronts at the same time. It was known as the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was to rapidly invade France and knock it out of the war quickly before Russia had a chance to mobilize its military. However, there was a problem with that plan, which was that the border between France and Germany was very heavily fortified. That would inevitably slow down the invasion. A lot. To get around that, Germany decided that it would invade France by going through Belgium. It sent Belgium an ultimatum demanding that they allow the free movement of their troops through Belgium territory. Belgium rejected the ultimatum, and so the Germans declared war and invaded. However, Belgium had a security guarantee from Britain. After German troops advanced into Belgium, the British demanded that they leave. When the Germans didn't comply, Britain declared war. That was a disaster for Germany, as Britain was an incredibly powerful enemy to have. However, all that would be worth it if their lightning-fast invasion of France actually worked. Initially, it seemed like it was going to. Within a month, the Germans were getting extremely close to Paris, and it looked like they would quickly win the war. Then, at the Battle of the Marne, only about 60 kilometers away from Paris, 1 million French troops were able to repel the German attack. The failure to take Paris was a disaster for the Germans, as it meant that their plan to avoid a two-front war had failed. Now they were going to have to fight in the east and west at the same time. Over the next few months, the fighting in France became a stalemate. It devolved into brutal trench warfare with both sides, digging in to try to hold their ground. In the east, Russia was ready for war much sooner than expected. They actually made the first move, trying to invade and take the German capital, which would force Germany to surrender. In August, Russian forces moved into East Prussia, but the offensive was a complete disaster. What followed was the huge German success that I mentioned earlier. The Germans annihilated 2 Russian armies, pushing them back across the border. The Russians had made no progress and lost about 250,000 men. The Germans lost only about 40,000. All in all, by the end of 1914, Germany was in a better position than they had been when the war started. They had repelled the invading Russians in the east and occupied large and resource-rich territories from Belgium and France. However, on the negative side, they were fighting the two-front war that they had desperately wanted to avoid. Even so, the next year, they were able to go on the offensive against Russia. In May, they launched a huge attack with Austrian support and were able to break the Russian lines. The Russians were forced to withdraw a long way back and surrendered much of Eastern Europe. That was a big success for the Germans, but it wasn't enough to knock Russia out of the war. On the Western Front in France, the grueling trench warfare continued. Conditions in the trenches were horrific. Men had to contend with extreme cold, mud, disease, and the constant threat of artillery fire. It was becoming clear that the war was going to be a war of attrition, and it would come down to which side exhausted its men and resources first. That wouldn't favor Germany. It had a smaller population than its enemies and was also subject to a crippling blockade by the British. Its imports were severely restricted, leading to shortages at home. Although the German military was the best of any nation, in such a war of attrition, Germany might fail sooner than its enemies. 1916 would turn out to be a moderately successful year for the Germans. In February, they launched a massive attack at Verdun that was intended to bleed France dry. The idea was that Verdun had such symbolic importance to the French that they would commit an irrational number of men to protect it. However, while the battle did inflict horrific losses on the French, it failed to achieve a breakthrough and drained German resources, resulting in over 350,000 German casualties. Later that year, Germany was on the receiving end of an equally enormous attack, the SO offensive. The German troops were able to hold off the attack and inflicted more casualties on Britain and France than they suffered. They lost about 440,000 men, while Britain and France lost over 600,000. The Germans also had a moderate success in the East. In August, Romania entered the war against Germany, hoping to take advantage of the weakness of Austria-Hungary. However, the Germans responded quickly and efficiently. Under the command of competent German generals, a joint German and Austro-Hungarian force crushed the Romanian army in a matter of months. That meant that by the end of 1916, much of Romania was under occupation. Its oil fields and grain supplies were now serving the German war effort. However, it wasn't all good news for Germany. Russia launched a huge offensive against Austria-Hungary and actually came very close to knocking them out of the war. With Austria-Hungary on the verge of collapse, Germany was forced to send desperately needed resources and men to support them. Also, the situation within Germany itself was starting to get extremely bad. The British naval blockade, combined with a poor potato harvest, meant that there was a severe shortage of food. In desperation, the government gave people turnips to eat, a vegetable usually reserved for animal feed. Malnutrition became widespread, particularly amongst the working classes and children. That led to diseases like tuberculosis and rickets. Public morale began to plummet as people grew wary both of the endless war and the hunger that accompanied it. At the beginning of the war, there had been strong patriotic support for it, but that had diminished significantly. By 1917, civilian morale was at an all-time low, and the population's patience with the war effort was wearing thin. Strikes and protests broke out all across German cities. In April, more than 200,000 workers walked off the job in Berlin alone, demanding peace, better wages, and food. The government cracked down hard, but they weren't able to fully contain the crisis. Seeing that the war wasn't going their way, the Germans decided to make a desperate gamble to break the deadlock. They decided that they would use their submarines to attack civilian ships in the Atlantic Ocean. The hope was that they could starve Britain into submission. However, the policy had a major downside. Sinking civilian ships would inevitably mean that the Germans would end up killing Americans, which might provoke America to enter the war against them. The German military leaders were well aware of that risk, but they thought that Britain was on the brink of collapse, so they might be able to win the war before America could get involved. The gamble backfired spectacularly. Within 2 months, the German submarines had sunk 10 American ships and killed at least 24 American citizens. Eventually, in April of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Needless to say, that was a catastrophe for the Germans. The United States wasn't just any other country. It was the wealthiest, most industrially powerful nation in the world. Very quickly, American troops began to arrive in France. However, there was actually one piece of good news for the Germans. In Russia, revolution had toppled Tsar, leading to chaos in the Russian army. By the end of the year, the Bolsheviks had taken power, and they were promising to pull Russia out of the war. That might have been a turning point. A huge number of German forces were now free to go and fight in France. However, the German leaders overplayed their hand. With Russia defeated, they tried to take control of an enormous amount of Eastern Europe, including the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine. The German planners wanted to turn those territories into puppet states controlled by Berlin. Needless to say, the local populations in those regions were not up for that. There was widespread resistance, unrest, and instability that forced the Germans to leave 1 million soldiers there to police their new puppet states. Those men were desperately needed to fight in France because the situation there was looking worse and worse. All the time American troops were arriving, and very soon there would be far more than Germany could ever hope to overcome. In a last desperate bid to win the war, Germany launched a major offensive of 1918. First, they were incredibly successful and actually made it to within artillery range of Paris. It was by far the biggest advance that either side had made in years. However, those victories came at a huge cost, and the Germans couldn't sustain the offensive. They simply didn't have enough men or supplies. Over the next few weeks, the tide began to turn. Supported by a huge number of American troops, the Allies launched a massive counterattack. It was called the 100 Days Offensive, and it shattered the German lines, driving them into a full retreat. To make matters worse for Germany, their allies were starting to collapse. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September. The Ottoman Empire followed in October. Then in early November, Austria-Hungary, Germany's closest ally, also surrendered. Germany was at that point completely alone. At home, the situation was catastrophic. Because of the British blockade, the population was starving. Finally, at the end of October, the German Navy was ordered to perform a suicidal attack against the British in the North Sea. The German sailors refused. They mutinied, and their defiance sparked a nationwide revolution. Soldiers refused to fight and workers went on strike. By early November, the cities were in open revolt. Eventually, on November the 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on November the 11th, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. The war was over. So that is what happened. The Germans performed exceptionally, and even though they lost, it was a very close thing. So why was that? What made Germany so effective? Well, I think a big part of the story is simply that pre-World War I, Germany took warfare and military matters extremely seriously. The military was the most important institution, and the whole of German society revolved around the ability to fight a war. There is actually a great quote that really sums up how important the military was in Germany. It's from the French statesman Mirabeau in the 1700s, and he's talking about Prussia, the German province that went on to lead the unification of Germany. He supposedly said, "Prussia is not a country with an army, but an army with a country." In 1914, on the eve of World War I, that was still very true. Germany was extremely well prepared for war. Its whole society revolved around it. A good example of that is that Germany had the most developed and sophisticated command structure of any nation at the time. In particular, I'm talking about one extremely important institution, the German Great General Staff. That was the brain behind the German war machine. Now, other nations of the age did, of course, each have a general staff for its military, but they were nowhere near as advanced and, frankly, ruthlessly meritocratic as the German general staff. Its officers were selected through a rigorous process of examinations and merit-based promotions, which ensured that it was made up of only the most intelligent and strategically minded men. Only a tiny fraction of officers, roughly 1 to 2%, survived the competitive selection and training process. Officers would be educated in the ideas of the famous Prussian military thinker Karl von Clausewitz. They would also spend a lot of time drawing up plans for war. Those could be mobilization schedules designed to coordinate the rapid deployment of millions of troops. They could also be plans like the Schlieffen Plan, the strategy to avoid fighting a war with both France and Russia at the same time. The German Great General Staff had some key differences with the other general staffs of the other countries at the time. Its focus on meritocracy was particularly unique. In the French army, for example, there was actually an anti-intellectual bias with intelligence viewed as less important than bravery. The general staffs of Russia and Austria-Hungary were far from being meritocratic. In those nations, being of noble birth was a far more important factor in getting to the top of the military. They were also plagued with court politics and the meddling of politicians. The German General Staff, by contrast, was very independent of politics, and it answered only to the king. That meant that civilian politicians had no way to influence it and pursue their agenda. One big benefit of that ruthlessly meritocratic ethos of the German General Staff was that it meant that the lower-level German officers were also incredibly competent. That allowed the leadership to be much more decentralized. The officers themselves had far more power to make decisions on the battlefield. The high-level commanders would decide the objectives, but then the subordinates were granted a lot of freedom in their execution. For officers to take the initiative wasn't just allowed, but actually encouraged. In fact, the German military's tactical manual itself included the passage, "A favorable situation will never be exploited if commanders wait for orders. The highest commander and the youngest soldier must always be conscious of the fact that omission and inactivity are worse than resorting to the wrong method. Essentially, the most important thing on the battlefield is to react and do something. Exactly how the officer chooses to react to the situation is secondary. That sort of war doctrine was quite unique to the Germans. Other nations had a much more centralized command structure, and decisions could only be taken by men higher up the chain. Over time, the other nations did learn to empower their lower ranks too. But the Germans were way ahead of them. The German obsession with war also meant that they made sure that they always had well-trained men. At that time, all the nations of Europe wanted to have the biggest armies that they could, but of course, they simply couldn't afford to pay millions of men to be professional soldiers that did nothing else. The compromise that they all struck was to have a relatively small professional army of full-time soldiers, which was then in times of war backed up by a huge number of reservists. For most nations, there were several times more reservists than professional soldiers. For example, France had about 800,000 professional soldiers, but almost 3 million reservists. Russia had about 1.3 million professional soldiers and about 412 million reservists. Of course, since World War I would turn out to be such a huge war, the reservists would turn out to be extremely important for each country's war effort. Now, the Germans didn't have the most reservists. In fact, they had far less than the likes of Russia. However, they did have some crucial advantages. One is that their reservists were better trained. The Germans invested heavily in large training camps that allowed them to train their conscripts much more effectively. The German leaders were well aware that a war would involve huge armies, longer-ranged weapons, and large-scale tactics and maneuvers. That meant they wanted to have large training camps where they could practice those things. By 1912, Germany had 26 big training areas which were over 5,000 hectares each. That is about the size of a city of 50,000 people. Those huge training centers allowed the German army to simulate realistic war situations. That was completely different to the other nations. For instance, France. France had only 8 training camps, all of them significantly smaller than the German ones. And because of that, they weren't able to practice large maneuvers. Another major advantage that the Germans had is that they were able to mobilize those reservists and get them to the battlefield much faster than the other nations were able to. The Germans were so obsessed with war that they had drawn up extremely detailed plans for how to mobilize their forces. Their plans were so detailed that they knew exactly which units would go into which train carriages and at what times the trains would depart. Army mobilization schedules were pre-written on railway times, so the troops knew exactly what time they had to be there. The Germans also benefited from having a much better railway network than France. They had more track laid and about twice as many trains. All that meant that the German mobilization was about 2 to 3 days ahead of the French one. Now that might not sound like a lot, but it was actually very important. It meant that the French were always reacting to what the Germans did. They were having to play catch-up. That was a particularly big problem because the Germans weren't doing what the French had planned for. The German plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was basically a very big flank from the right. The French plan was called Plan 17, and it assumed that Germany would attack through its shared border with France. When Germany didn't do that, the French were taken off guard. Add to that the faster German mobilization, and it starts to make sense why the Germans were able to get so far into France so fast. I think that is a big part of the explanation for why the whole war on the Western Front would be fought on French soil. As you can see, Germany's very militaristic society was a big part of why it performed so well in the war, but it was certainly not the only reason. Another big factor was that they were very innovative throughout the war. A good example of that is how they innovated with artillery. The Germans were very quick to realize that mortars were going to be very useful in trench warfare. You see, the defining feature of a mortar is that it fires the shell at a very high angle. That meant that they could actually get the mortar shells to arc over the trench walls and land inside the enemy trenches. Another big advantage of mortars was that they were smaller than other artillery like howitzers or field guns. That meant that they could be carried by infantry teams. They didn't need to be pulled by horses. For example, the smallest German mortar was the 758mm mining warfare. It was on wheels and weighed only about 150 kilodors, making it possible to maneuver by a 5-man crew. Mortars had a transformative impact on trench warfare and fundamentally altered the tactics that everyone was using. Because they could be moved by infantry, they could provide on-demand immediate firepower to destroy barbed wire or enemy machine gun nests. Now, to be clear, the other powers did use mortars. The Germans were certainly not alone in using them. However, the Germans were the first to realize how useful they would be for trench warfare. The Germans made heavy use of mortars right from the beginning of the war, while Britain and France took about 2 years to really start using them as much as they should have. Another important German innovation was a new defensive doctrine, what has been called elastic defense. Essentially, it was the idea that it wasn't necessary to hold a rigid line against attacks to try to hold ground at all costs. That strategy had actually led to huge losses in previous battles, and even then, the front lines could sometimes be breached. Recognizing that, the German generals came up with the idea of elastic defense, a more flexible strategy that focused on defense in depth. Essentially, the German front would be made up of 3 lines. At the front was a thinly held outpost line, which wasn't really designed to provide much resistance. Instead, it was mainly intended to disrupt and delay the enemy advance. Behind that was the main battle line where the bulk of the resistance would be concentrated. That often featured concrete bunkers which could deliver interlocking machine gun fire. Finally, at the very back, there was the rear line which was outside of enemy artillery range. That was mainly intended to house forces that would counterattack if the front 2 lines were broken. The core idea was to avoid having too many men too close to the front where they were vulnerable to artillery or encirclement. German troops were trained to accept the temporary loss of the forward trenches, safe in the knowledge that rapid and well-coordinated counterattacks would soon win them back. Perhaps the best example of the effectiveness of the strategy was at the Battle of Ars in 1917. The British had more men, about 23 divisions, against the German 17. However, the German elastic defense system was able to repel the British attack, and they actually ended up inflicting far more casualties than they took. One final important German infiltration tactics innovation was the development of what were known as infiltration tactics. Essentially, rather than sending thousands of men across no man's land in big frontal attacks, the Germans tried using small groups of elite soldiers to covertly sneak into the enemy trenches. There would cause as much shock and confusion as possible. The elite units were made up of highly trained soldiers called stormtroopers. The stormtroopers weren't armed with rifles, but instead were armed with a plethora of close combat weapons, such as grenades, pistols, or even knives. Importantly, because infiltration fighting was so chaotic and fast-moving, the stormtroopers were trained to operate semi-autonomously. The stormtroopers were very effective and actually made a big difference on the battlefield. A good example is at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. The British attacked with more than 450 tanks, and initially they had a lot of success. They were able to penetrate the German defenses up to 7 kilometers. However, the Germans used their stormtroopers to counterattack, and it was very effective. They were able to infiltrate the British lines and cause mayhem. That led to the British canceling the main infantry attack that was to follow the tank assault. The result was that the British lost all of their territorial gains and 1/3 of their tanks. Another great example of the effectiveness of infiltration tactics is the German offensives of 1918. Just to remind you, at that point, the Germans knew that time wasn't on their side, and so they tried to do one last big offensive to knock France out of the war. That offensive was initially very successful, and infiltration tactics were a big part of the reason why. Again, the German stormtroopers infiltrated the British trench system and threw the defense into chaos. Entire British divisions were flanked and compelled to retreat or be encircled. The bulk of the German forces followed behind the stormtroopers and were able to take advantage of the confusion. In total, the Germans advanced about 40 Babrauardme, or halfway to Paris. That collapse of the deadlock of trench warfare was in large part because of infiltration tactics. I'd say that those are the main reasons that Germany performed so well in the war, but I do think there are a few other things worth mentioning. One is that the Germans started the war with more artillery. In particular, the Germans had a big advantage in heavy artillery, for example, their 420mm siege howitzers, which they nicknamed Big Bertha. They were designed for smashing concrete and gave the Germans a big advantage in the early battles. At the very start of the war, as the Germans invaded Belgium, they were able to use those huge guns to demolish the Belgian forts in a few days. The Allies didn't have anything comparable at the start of the war, and so the Germans were at an advantage for quite a while. Something else worth mentioning is that the Germans performed extremely well on the home front. That is to say that their war economy functioned well because of the British naval blockade. It was very difficult for them to import anything, and so virtually everything, whether food or ammunition, had to be produced at home. The Germans did a very good job of that. For most of the war, their men had the supplies that they needed to fight. Innovation in science and industry helped overcome resource shortages. For instance, German chemists developed the Haber process to manufacture ammonia for explosives and fertilizers that mitigated the loss of nitrate imports. Finally, the Germans were also very good at logistics. That is in large part because of something that I mentioned earlier, their very advanced railway system that allowed them to quickly transfer troops to where they were most needed, meaning that they could make the best use of their men. For example, in 1914, after they just managed to repel the Russian invasion in the east, they very quickly transferred those divisions by train to the Western Front. No other country in the war was able to execute such large-scale troop transfers with such speed. Overall, there were many reasons that Germany performed so well in the First World War. If I were to pick a single thing that I think was the most important, I would definitely choose their leadership structure. In particular, I'm talking about their ruthlessly meritocratic selection of officers and commanders. That meant that from the generals at the top to the officers at the bottom, the German commanders were simply more intelligent, higher IQ than the average man. To have intelligence be so highly valued in their military meant that better decisions were made, whether that was an officer deciding what to do on the battlefield or a general deciding on much higher-level strategy. I think that might be the biggest reason that Germany was able to take on three of the most powerful countries in Europe and still come very close to winning.